Welcome to the Tropical Homesteading Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of the Tropical Homesteading Podcast. My name is Abraham from Bluewater Barnyard in North Queensland, Australia. I decided to start this podcast as a way to share my experiences homesteading in the tropics. I find that there's less homesteading content from the tropics in general, so I thought this might be a good addition to the market, though a lot of the stuff that I'm focused on isn't exclusive to the tropics by any means. The focus of this podcast will be on general homesteading, self-reliance, self-sufficiency, a lot of the sort of stuff that goes hand in hand with a homesteading lifestyle wherever you are. As a bit of an introduction about me, I live on my homestead in North Queensland. We have small acreage where we breed Nigerian dwarf goats and various chickens and a bunch of other animals really. I work in heavy industry with rotating equipment, which means that I do travel a lot, working in various different environments with random schedules, which can make homesteading a little bit more challenging than if I was home more or even had a regular travel roster. But luckily for me, I have a great partner who is able to take care of everything while I'm away, which is fantastic. So, as I said, I'm not a professional at this. This is just something that I've been doing for a while now, and I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've learned a lot of lessons along the way. And I thought this would be a good avenue to share those lessons with others. The topic should be fairly diverse in general for this podcast, in that sometimes I'll talk about plants, sometimes I'll talk about tools, sometimes I'll talk about fishing, lots of different things. But it'll all be in a self-reliance and self-sufficiency sort of area. So as a start to this podcast, I thought that I would do a first topic on my 10 hero plants, i.e. 10 plants that I find to be the most useful and that I try to always grow for me living in the tropics for a variety of uses. Okay, so getting into the first hero plant, well, my main hero plant really that I tend to grow in my homestead in the tropics is sweet potato. Now, it doesn't really matter which sweet potato you're looking at. There are a bunch of different varieties. I tend to often grow the white ones, but it could be the purple ones, the orange ones, whatever sort of thing. I grow these all the time. These are the main plant on my homestead. They just thrive in the tropics. They are super easy to plant. Effectively, I use them for myself and I use them for my animals. So just as a bit of a primer, you can go and buy a sweet potato from any sort of plant store or whatever, but you can also grow it just from the stuff in the supermarket. You've often seen those things where people will submerge part of the sweet potato in water and they'll wait until it starts to grow roots and then you can plant it. But if you are able to get access to someone else growing the plant, all you need to do is take the most basic of cuttings and stick it in the ground and it'll essentially start growing and it'll form essentially a ground cover. So we all know that it produces tubers and everything like that, and you can eat those and those will store well. But the thing that I actually tend to grow it for is its leaves and the plant itself. They are fantastic fodder. You can eat them yourself if you're really keen. The small leaves are edible. You're going to be spending a while picking small little leaves from your patch, but they are definitely edible. The bigger ones are still edible. They're just a bit woodier and not as nice. But if you can pick the small leaves, they're a great spinach substitute. You can use them cooked, you can use them in salads, anything like that. You just want to wash them because they tend to have like a white sap that will come out when you pick them. It's not a big deal. But in any case, the actual green part themselves, the plant, you can just pick it up off the ground from a big patch. You just rip it out of the ground and throw it to your chickens, your geese. The geese love it. Pigs love it. Goats love it. Pretty much everybody loves it. It's the easiest thing to grow and it will just keep growing back. So I will have patches where I will plant my sweet potato and then I will just, as it starts to get fairly dense, it forms a ground cover effectively. You can just go and rip a bunch out, throw it to the animals, leave it for, it seems like a couple of weeks, and it'll just come back and it'll just keep going and going and going. And so much to the point where I've had it before where I've just opened up areas of my sweet potato patches to my goats or to my pigs or anything like that. They will eat it down to the ground. You will think that it is just completely gone and decimated. But if you leave it for a couple of weeks, it comes back. I've had it to the point where it will work its way into my lawn sometimes, and even after being mown with the lawnmower, the plant just comes back. It is the most resilient plant that you could imagine. And then afterwards, you can dig up the tubers and you can eat them for yourself. And I find that a lot of the tubers that I grow, they don't tend to be quite as pretty as the ones that you would get from the shop, and maybe that's because of my style and how I just plant them everywhere and I effectively use them as a cover crop. I think that they tend to get more bug damage, and I'll hit them and stuff like that, so they're a little bit messier, but they still clean up just as well, and you can still eat them. And all of the stuff that you trim from the sweet potato, I actually end up cooking that in with my dog's food, and that gives my dog a bunch of extra fiber and whatnot, and makes use and bulks out of the sweet potato. So yeah, highly recommend sweet potato to anybody. You can eat the leaves. Your animals can eat the leaves. If you don't have animals, it's a great thing for composting. You can just grow it and then put it through, say, a mulcher, say on your mower, and put it into your composting thing. It's high in nitrogen. It's great for that. Incredibly useful. I grow it everywhere. I'd highly recommend it. And next up, we've got kangkong, also known as water spinach, Chinese water spinach. I think over in Southeast Asia, they call it morning glory. It's got a bunch of different names. Essentially, it's a leafy green sort of plant. And the reason that they call it water spinach is that it can survive in water, but it doesn't actually require that. And this is why it's so good. You can grow this plant, kangkong, in pretty much any condition. Obviously, it does require a lot of water, so you do need to actually be watering it or whatever. But you can have it in marshy ground, you can have it in just regular soil, you can have it in the water, and it is just so useful. So it's a form of spinach, I suppose. It's a leafy green, and I suppose leafy greens, I think, are one of the undervalued things that people can grow at home. I mean, if you think about it, people like to think about growing potatoes, they grow broccoli, they grow a lot of stuff that they can get at the shops. And that's great, but if you actually work out how much broccoli costs per kilo, what are you talking about, $6 a kilo? If you think about how much potatoes are, whatever, how much money are you actually saving? And that's not the only reason that we homestead, but really, if you actually look at what leafy greens are worth, say if you go and get a small packet of spinach, for example, and I know it's not kangkong, but still, you can be paying up to $30 a kilo. That's the same price as steak, really. And to be able to just grow leafy greens yourself, because if you think about how much they cost, how much space they take up in your fridge, how quickly they go off if you're to buy them, just being able to grow your leafy greens, you're going to be able to harvest them as you need, and especially something like kangkong, it just keeps growing. I have a perpetual patch of kangkong in one of my raised garden beds, and I also have them in other areas where I'm growing them for my chickens and I'm growing them for my goats and everything like that. But if you're not familiar with them, essentially it's a stalky sort of plant that will then grow out small leaves, and it will produce like a white flower every now and again. So you can grow it from seed, and that's probably going to be one of the ways that you're going to get it the easiest, is to try and order some seeds from somewhere. It germinates fairly easily. But once it starts growing, it's sort of an indeterminate sort of plant. So if you just let it crawl across the ground, it will eventually get covered by some mulch or something, and it will throw down more roots, and it will just spread, much like sweet potato that we talked about before. And it's one of the most productive leafy green plants you can get. The leaves, I wouldn't call them really so much of a salad green. They're a tiny bit hard for a salad green, but they're fantastic wilted. You can use them basically as a spinach substitute in soups, stews, sautés, that sort of stuff. But they also have like a stem that they grow off. So there's a main sort of plant sort of thing, like a vine, for lack of a better word, though it doesn't sort of crawl up anything. And then off that main vine, there are like a stalk that will come up, and then a leaf on the end. Now, the leaves, they'll grow up to about 180 millimeters or so, and then they'll have the stalk beneath them. The leaves you use just like spinach, but the stalks you can also use. They're sort of a little bit like a bean or so, I suppose, in that they have a tiny bit more crunch. So if you were doing a stir fry or something like that, you can have the leaves wilted and you can use the stalks for a bit more extra texture and a bit more extra crunch. So these things will grow pretty much anywhere as long as you've got enough water around. You can have them floating in water. You can grow them in aquaponics. Like I said, I just have them in a garden bed where I grow most of my stuff from. And I also have them inside a bathtub that is filled with water that's in my chicken yard, and then they can grow through that area and the chooks can get to them. They replicate very, very easily from cuttings. So it's simply a case of finding a piece of new growth, snipping it off with some scissors, taking off the majority of the leaves so that you're not going into shock, and just transplanting it, and it will grow. And you can just propagate sort of ad infinitum from there. But also, as I said, they will just sprout on the ground and sort of keep growing out because they're indeterminate. So in my example of my raised garden bed, the gardens keep sinking as they ordinarily would do, but I don't want to pull out my essentially perennial crop of kangkong. It's not a perennial, but in the way that it keeps growing, it sort of acts like it. It's a constant going bed. As an aside, if you are doing that, you have to make sure that you are keeping up with the required nutrients and minerals and everything like that, because obviously the best is to do a crop rotation. My kangkong has stayed in the same bed for about 3 years now, so I'm careful to make sure that it gets plenty of fertilizer, plenty of mineral supplement and whatever, so that it can actually stay healthy and it's not depleting itself. But it's an excellent sort of water plant. It's an excellent in-ground plant. It's great for people to eat. It's great for animals to eat. I've never met any of the animals that won't love it. It's just, you can use it for birds, you can use it for goats, you can use it for pigs, you can use it for anything. Highly recommend it. Super hardy, super resilient, very useful, and you can just grow it in water, which will help if you are growing something with weeds around. If you can just submerge the whole, say a bathtub or a wicking bed or something like that, they'll be able to survive where weeds won't, which is going to make it very useful, and I use it almost every day when I'm cooking. Next up, I've got the moringa. Now, I don't know if we really count trees as plants, but I'm going to count them in this instance. And I think the moringa is one of those things that I've always wanted to be growing. It's a very useful tree in that it serves a whole bunch of different purposes. Now, a common theme that I'm going to be going on with these plants is their ease of plantability, and I suppose I'll get into that, but I suppose I should explain the moringa more if you're not familiar with it. It's also known as the drumstick tree, quite common through the tropics, also common through India, through the Philippines, through Hawaii, that sort of region. They would call them the drumstick tree because they have a long, I suppose, it's almost like a bean pod that is sort of the size and shape of a drumstick, and that can be eaten. There, it has the seed pods inside it, but there's almost like a sort of a mush, a little bit like cooked zucchini, I suppose, that you can use in various curries, soups, and stews. If I'm honest, I don't do that too often. It seems like a bunch of work to me, and I have other veggies that I can use instead of that. But what I do use it for is its leaves, most commonly. So it's a fairly, it can be a big tree. You can keep it sort of contained in pots if you'd like. But the leaves themselves, they produce like a small leaf about maybe 12 millimeters in size, and it sort of branches out in these big sort of stems. And those leaves, they're sort of like a nutty flavored leaf that you could use in sautés, in stir fries, in soups, stews, that sort of thing. And they're fine raw. I eat them sometimes raw when I'm just out in the garden. Like I said, they do have a bit of a nuttier flavor. You can use it just like a general green, I suppose. It is also said to have some anti-inflammatory properties. Whilst I'm sure that is true, I don't necessarily know how you would maintain the anti-inflammatory nature of it, and if you sort of necessarily want to be medicating yourself from a tree or whatever, that's a sort of a bit of a hotbed topic there. But you certainly can dehydrate the leaves and then make them into a powder, and people like to make a tea out of that, and they say that it's good for their inflammation or so. And I suppose in small enough quantities it can't hurt if that's what you want to go with. Also, it's very fast growing. You'll throw it up and a couple of years old, and you've got a tree that's producing a lot of sort of shade and a lot of fruit and a lot of leaves for you. So that's always quite nice. It coppices very well. It makes great mulch because it's just so much product, and it works quite well as an animal feed. I feed it to my goats, and they basically eat the whole branches because they'll chew through the bark and everything like that. But even the chickens, they love the leaves, and yeah, it's got a great amount of sort of it's good for fodder. Like I said, it's good as almost like a tree-based, truly perennial leafy vegetable, almost, as well as the actual fruit that you can take from it. And it will just so easily produce, like I said, coppices and cuttings, anything like that, very, very easy, as well as you can just grow it from seeds quite easily as well. I highly recommend having it. They're hardy, they're easy to grow. You can grow them in pots, you can grow them in the ground. Fantastic tree to add for both human and animal food. All right, moving on to the next one, have the banana. Now, the banana is a fantastic fruit to be able to grow if you're able to grow it, and being in the tropics, it just grows so easily. The banana is not a tree as such. We treat it as a tree, but it's actually a corm or a rhizome-based plant. It's a herbaceous perennial, strictly speaking. So what that means is that the banana sort of corm or rhizome lives under the ground, and it will produce a new plant coming off its underground rhizome, and that will grow fairly quickly, and it will produce one large bunch of bananas per plant that comes up effectively. So once you are able to get your bananas, you will cut them down, you'll harvest your bananas, and then that tree will never produce any bananas again. So it's not really worth keeping around because it's just sapping nutrient from the rhizome. And what you'll notice is if you plant one banana and it takes off, now you have to sometimes be a little bit careful about how you plant them and how wet the roots get and everything like that. But once you've got an established banana plant, the rhizome underneath will just keep producing sucker plants next to it, pups they're called. And you have to be careful to identify which ones are actually producing bananas and which ones aren't, which ones are just going to be taking away from the nutrient on the area or whatever. But that's a separate point. We'll sort of get into that in a second. But effectively, everyone knows the bananas, right? I think they're the second most commonly eaten fruit in the world. They produce a fantastic fruit. Obviously, we all know that. But there's other uses for it as well. So first and foremost, when you grow your banana, you will start to notice the flower coming out from a fruiting tree. And then that flower, it's like a purpley sort of colored bell. And then inside that flower are all of the individual flowers that will actually become bananas if they're suitably pollinated. So as the plant grows, it will sort of elongate its stem, and then the flowers will, as they're pollinated, they become the bananas, and then they grow in their hands on each sort of section of what the flower was, and then the stem keeps growing down, and then eventually you end up with a full bunches of bananas, and then you have the flower sort of bell underneath. Now, it's best to cut that bell off once you've seen that it's quite clearly not going to grow any more bananas. You'll see that the stem can be maybe 400 millimeters below where the last banana is growing. It's not going to do anything for you, so it's best to cut that off. You can eat that. I've seen people pickle the flowers. You can make curries with them, all that sort of stuff, the actual individual flowers that are within the bell. I've tried it. It's fine if you want to do that much work. To me, it doesn't seem quite worth it, so I tend to use it for other things. Like I'll feed it to my animals, or I'll compost it, or I'll put it in my garden beds as a sort of a chop and drop sort of situation. But once you've got the bananas, then obviously we can eat the bananas. Bananas are tasty. You can dehydrate them, which I do a bit. If you've never done it before, dehydrated bananas are not like the banana chips that you get from the shops. Those banana chips are freeze-dried and they're crunchy. The ones that you will get from a dehydrator, if you do it at home, they're a lot chewier, lots sweeter, and somewhat tackier. so they're not necessarily the same snacking thing, but they are good and you can rehydrate them or whatever. Personally, I freeze them, so I will tend to chop them up and then I'll put them into, say, 1 cup or 2 cup packs. I put them in Ziploc bags. I push as much of the air as I can out of them, and I freeze them flat on a upright freezer. And then I'll have essentially flat packed things of frozen banana, which I can use for banana cakes, banana pancakes, anything that you want to have cooked banana with. So that's very useful. In the event that you don't get to all of your bananas in time and they start going a little bit bad, or for whatever reason you don't want to eat all of them, fantastic food for chickens, for most poultry really. They love eating it. I mean, you have to be a bit careful sometimes if you don't get to them in time. I find that bowerbirds will hang off the actual banana bunches underneath and they peck in through the banana to eat the flesh. So birds obviously love them. My goats, they do like them, though you have to be a bit careful with how much sugar that you're giving to a ruminant. But pigs will love the bananas, and you can also give them the banana skins and everything like that as well. They're also high in potassium, and they're good for your compost in that they're adding potassium, but you also have to consider that that potassium has to come from somewhere, right? So if you are making compost from a potassium source that's come from your bananas, then you have obviously depleted the potassium from the ground, so that the way your bananas have grown. So sometimes it can help to make sure you put that back in and sort of supplement your potassium if you need to, which, obviously it's a pretty basic sort of gardening thing. But the other thing about the bananas is they're not just fruit. They're not just the fruit. They are also the banana plant itself. Now, we all know banana leaves, the big, huge leaves that we see in the movies and everything like that. You can use them to roll up food and to steam it, like in Asian dishes and whatnot. Not necessarily the most practical, but it's a bit of fun and looks very nice for presentation stuff. Say if you were to roll a fish in a banana leaf and then steam it or something like that, it makes great presentation. But also they are great goat food. My chickens, they do eat a little bit, but my goats, they love it. Even my sheep like the banana leaves. They don't tend to eat so much of the stems, but they do love the leafy part. And then moving on to the stems themselves, as I said before, when you harvest a bunch of bananas, that plant, for lack of a word, that tree, whatever it is you want to call it, that you took the bunch off, that will never produce another bananas again. So you should get rid of it because it's just sucking nutrients away from the rhizome. So if you've never dealt with banana, they are one of the easiest things to cut. They are like a layered sort of a plant. They look a little bit like something like bok choy or something like that. They're a very wet, fibrous, easily cut thing. You can cut them easily with a reciprocating saw or a chainsaw, but obviously you can cut everything with a chainsaw. But even like a machete, I use a cane knife, and I use that to harvest the leaves at the start, and then when I've got the actual trunk, I suppose, I typically tend to use a pruning blade on a reciprocating saw, or I use my battery operated chainsaw, though I could use the cane knife if I wanted. It's just, if I'm being a little bit lazy, I use the power tools. And I cut that up into small, I suppose, discs. So let's say that the tree is about maybe 250 millimeters round, 300 millimeters round or so. I will cut that into, say, 100 millimeter discs. And I can generally get about one trunk of one plant, because I tend to grow the dwarf varieties, which I suppose is something I should mention. If you can grow the dwarf varieties, it's going to go so much better for you, because the bunches of bananas, they're actually really heavy. And I should say, when you are going to harvest your bananas, if you can, harvest them green. And the reason for that is the bananas, once they become yellow, they're very delicate. And so what you want to do is, when you are growing the bananas and you're looking at the bunches and they're getting bigger and bigger and whatnot, when they're growing, they sort of have a bit of a, not square profile, but angular sort of profile. Now, when we think of bananas, we think of them as being quite round, but when they're growing, they're a bit more of a, almost like a pentagonal sort of profile. when you see that the bananas are starting to round out effectively, like they sort of look like they're swelling on their profile and becoming more round, that's pretty much when they're ready to go. So if you harvest them then they'll be a lot hardier, and you can carry them, you can place them down, because if you think about it, these things, they're going to weigh about 20-30 kilos, and if you put 20 or 30 kilos on top of a ripe banana, you're squishing it. It's no good. So harvest them when they're green, and that's generally before the bowerbirds and stuff try and start stealing them, and then just put them in a dry, cool area, and they will ripen themselves. Bananas actually emit ethylene gas, and you can use them as a ripening agent for other fruits and vegetables if you are keen. You may have sometimes seen the bananas with the red tips on them, the wax tips. The reason they actually do that is because the bananas will emit ethylene gas, and they essentially ripen themselves and others, and they can make them go off quite quickly. So if you're able to stop that ethylene gas coming out, i.e. with a wax red tip, and the bananas will last a lot longer when they're ripe, which is sort of an aside. But the point is, once the bananas are rounded out and green, if you just leave them on a bench or somewhere where it's dry and cool and they're not under too much pressure, they will just turn yellow, and they will be just as good. They're not going to be any sweeter by leaving them on the tree. Yeah, that's the way to go. So anyway, going back to that, once you have harvested the bananas and you've cut down the leaves, if you can cut the sections of the trunk into about 100 mil discs, let's say, you can just chuck them in your wheelbarrow, you'll find that they will tend to almost split apart like an onion or like bok choy would into little small segments. Also, be careful, because they're very, very moisture laden, and I don't know what it is, but that stuff, it's kind of sticky and it stains. So just be careful. If you're going to get it on your clothes or whatever, it will stain you. It doesn't seem to burn as much as some other sap like from mango does, but still, just be careful because it gets everywhere. Anyway, you can use that as fodder. I find that my animals don't love the trunk as much, though people say that you can use it. But what it makes is an excellent mulch, and you don't even have to shred it or anything like that. Because of its structure and how it's sort of layered, it tends to break apart into pieces of banana stem. And whilst it's not as pretty as something like a sugarcane mulch or something like that, it certainly does the job. It acts as a mulch, and because it's so wet, it actually sort of leaches some of the water into your soil and whatnot. It tends to stay a lot moister, I find, and act as a really good mulch. And so you can use it there and cover that with something like a sugarcane mulch if you want to make it look pretty or whatever. But it certainly does add a lot to it. You will find though that, I don't know what the percentage is, but I'm going to say 65-70% of the actual mass of that banana plant is water. So when it actually does break down, you're going to find that there's not as much there as you thought there was. But yeah, works as an excellent form of mulch and almost like a hugelkultur sort of system. If you were building garden beds, you can put it underneath. But as I said, because most of it is water, if you build up the bottom of your garden beds with banana trunks, you're going to find that it's going to sink on you pretty quickly. So just bear that in mind. Okay, moving on to spring onions. Now, I'm a big fan of the spring onions. They are my allium of choice. Now, I have essentially a continual crop going of spring onions, and for one main reason is that they just grow so well and they will reproduce very easily. So I've tried growing a bunch of other onions before. I've done the Hunter River Brown, I've done the Egyptian walking onions, I've done leeks, I've done all that sort of stuff, and they work, right? And the good thing about something like a Hunter River Brown onion is that it will store well, right? You season it, you harvest it, you season it, you store it, happy days. But for me, being in the tropics, I don't necessarily have to worry about trying to store a large amount of produce over the winter or something, because I can essentially grow year round. And spring onions just do that. They just keep growing year round. You can grow them from seed, for sure. You can do all that sort of stuff. But what I tend to do is I just go to the supermarket and I will buy spring onions because they come with their roots. And I'll try to get the ones that look the healthiest and have the best root, sort of quality. And then I just go home and I stick them in my garden beds. And you will find that they will sort of be a little bit sad for a couple of days, but keep the water up to them. And then you notice that these sort of limp plants that were just sitting in your garden bed, they sort of change from that bright green that you would see in the shops to sort of almost like a bluey green. And they sort of have a bit of almost like a powder to them sort of quality, and you'll sort of see them change. You give them maybe a week or two, and they're growing in your garden. And the cool thing about them is you can just harvest them there by cutting them off at ground level. And if you cut them off, you don't get the roots in there, which, let's be honest, most of us just cut those off anyway. I know that you deep fry them in some forms of Chinese cooking, so maybe you're missing out there. But if you do just cut them off and leave them, you will find that in, say, a week or so, you'll start to notice a green shoot coming out from the area where you cut them down. And they will grow back to a full-size spring onion again. And they will do this, I don't know exactly how many times, because it becomes hard to judge, but I reckon I've got a harvest from the same plant, let's call it, maybe 4 or 5 times. You cut it back, it will produce a new one. And sometimes they look a little bit strange, they're going off to the side, they're not as regular or whatever, but they grow back many times. And once you actually start growing them, they get enormous. I have had people think that I'm growing leeks, and they're actually spring onions. You just let them grow, and they will just keep getting. They'll get, say, maybe 450 mils tall and 30 mils wide. And you cut them off at the base, just leave them as they go. Sometimes, as they start getting that big, a couple of the leaves or the sort of outer layers, I suppose, get a little bit scabby, but you just peel those off and throw them back in and mulch on your sort of garden, and you've got them as your onion. And the good thing about them when they sort of get to that size is they're a somewhat milder onion for sure. They're sort of like a leek, I suppose, by that stage. But you can use them for pretty much anything that you would use a regular brown, not anything you could use a regular brown onion for. Let's say something like if I'm doing caramelized onions to go on a burger or sausages or something. I do prefer the brown ones, I will admit. But if I'm using it just as a sweet and allium base, like on a spaghetti or a soup or a stew or a curry or anything like that, where it's just sort of the flavoring element that's going into it and you don't necessarily get the individual texture, then yeah, I would use those spring onions for 90% of my cooking, I would say. And they have the white bit down the bottom, which you can use in the milder stuff. But as you get closer to the green part at the top, it becomes better for some of the stuff you might want to put in a salad, or towards the end of, say, if you're doing a laksa or a ramen or whatever, you keep that green bit at the top for a bit of a fresh garnish right at the end, because it has that sort of brightness and freshness of flavor. I will say that one of the differences in the larger spring onions, when you let them grow, is that they do tend to have a bit more mucilage, which can be a bit off-putting if you're not used to it. And if you're not aware of mucilage, it's essentially almost like a sticky gunk. Which I'm saying, and I get why people don't like it. It's a little bit like the other plant that's most common for having mucilage is okra. If you've ever grown that before or cooked with that, it looks a little bit like, for lack of a better word, snot. And you can just wash that away. But in some ways, that's actually a good thing for certain dishes. I mean, like I said, okra is the traditional one that has mucilage, and you would use that for a dish like gumbo that they would produce over in southern USA. And it's sort of like you can use it almost like a thickening agent in some sort of way. It's because it ways. And so, if you are trying to sort of thicken a stew, sometimes it can help to have that mucilage in there. It doesn't tend to be down the bottom in the actual sort of white part of the spring onion, but more towards the leaves. So you can get away with it a lot. But in the sort of, you wouldn't have to deal with the mucilage if you're just using the white part. But if you were to crush some of the green stalks that you'd ordinarily throw away and then add them to, say, a stock or a broth, you will find that it does have a bit of a thickening effect, which can be quite good. If you want that, it's great. And if you don't want that, you can just wash it away. So Highly recommend the spring onions. You don't have to mess around with starting from seed or anything like that. You just go to the supermarket, get some spring onions, stick them in the ground. A week later, you can harvest them if you want. You can let them grow bigger. You cut them, they'll grow back. It's just rinse and repeat. I think that that's not infinite, but I would say maybe, like I said, you get 4 or 5 harvests, and you just harvest them occasionally. You just go out and harvest the one you want or 2 you want for that evening's cooking, and then just leave them, and they'll grow back, and then you can mix and match and sort of get different areas from different sort of parts of the garden bed or whatnot, so it's constantly growing. And then as you find over a couple of months or a year or something like that, that it looks like there's maybe less spring onions than you remember being in there because some of them just aren't growing from their root base anymore, just head down to the supermarket, get another bunch of spring onions, stick them in there, and you're good to go. Highly recommend it. It's my main allium, and I will always grow them. Moving on to the mulberry. Now, I love the mulberry. You can get a bunch of different varieties. There's white mulberry, there's black mulberry, there's long mulberries, there's a whole bunch of different types. But I would say that the main 2 distinctions would be a traditional mulberry and a dwarf mulberry. And I think both of them have their uses. So if you're not familiar with a mulberry, it's a small hardy tree. Does great in the tropics, but you can also grow them, pretty much in most areas, really. I don't know how they take being full frozen, but you can get them to go pretty much most places. And the 2 main uses are the first and foremost, it's going to be the berry, right? It's a mulberry. The berries are going to be your main sort of thing that you're going for here. They're quite a sweet, tasty berry, and you can use them just eaten fresh. You can use them in jams, preserves, that sort of thing. The problem with them, and the reason why you don't see them in the supermarket so often, is that they are very delicate. They don't travel well, and they can age quite quickly. So they're one of those things that it's actually best, in my opinion, to try to grow something that you can't get otherwise. So, you could go and get apples. You can have an apple tree, and you can have bananas, I referenced before, and whatever. But really, you could go and get them from the store. It's very difficult to find mulberry, and so I think that makes it quite a good thing to grow, because how else could you get it, right? You can turn the mulberries, you can eat them, obviously. Like I said, jams, they make a great sort of sauce that you can use over, say, an ice cream or something like that. You can turn them into a mulberry wine, all that sort of stuff, as well as just eating them fresh. But you can also feed them to your chickens or your pigs. You can eat them. You give them to ruminants, but obviously, like I said before, you got to be careful. Anything that's got too much sugar for a ruminant. But most animals are gonna love your mulberries, so that's always a thing. I know a bunch of people that will grow mulberry trees in their chicken yards, or if they have free-range chickens, then their chickens will just be hanging around the base of the mulberry tree trying to get the mulberries that fall and to jump up and grab them. But the other thing that you can do with them is use the leaves for fodder. Now, as I've said before, goats, chickens, pigs, all that sort of stuff, they all love them. But if you're real keen, the other thing that actually likes the mulberries is the silkworm. Now, this isn't something I do myself, and I'm not sure that I really could be bothered doing it, but if you're not aware, silk, the fabric, it actually comes from fibre that it comes out of the back of a silkworm, which I believe is a type of caterpillar, and it only eats mulberry leaves, sort of thing. So if you're real keen, you could do that. I don't know how practical that is, but still, it's an option. But the leaves themselves are very high in protein, or crude protein, I suppose, and iron, which can make them really good fodder for ruminants and even for chickens. I suppose the difference between the dwarf and the regular varieties will obviously be the height of the tree itself. Say a dwarf tree would be about maybe 2 meters tall, I would say, whereas an actual proper established real mulberry tree, they will grow significantly larger into proper sized trees. And the difference you're going to notice as well is the size of the leaves. So they're sort of proportional. The leaves from a dwarf mulberry tree will be quite small, half the size of the palm of your hand, versus the bigger mulberry leaves from a full-size tree will be about the size of your hand. So that to factor in. Something I will say is that, like most berries, they won't really produce much fruit on the same branch that they came from. So in the same way, if you were to go with something more like a raspberry or a blackberry, where you'd have those canes and you should prune them back, it's sort of the similar thing with mulberry tree. So once you've had your harvest of your fruit through the season, prune them back, it'll produce new growth, and that new growth will have more berries, which is, what I think the best reason for having mulberry is the berries themselves. But if you don't, you're still going to have the fodder. You're still going to have a shade tree, which is always nice to have. Also, I suppose on both the dwarf and the full size variety, you could harvest the timber from both, but you're not going to get much off the dwarf. But the timber itself, because it's a fruit wood, it's quite good for smoking. You can use it for when you're barbecuing and stuff. Generally, people consider it to be a mild sweet sort of flavor. It's not as sort of famous as some of the other, maybe apple or hickory or anything like that. But I think partly that's because, like I said, it's not grown on a commercial scale like some other trees are. So because there's less of it around, it's maybe less common, so people don't think about it, and it's sort of a bit of a self-repeating cycle. But it does produce quite a good smoke for smoking as well. So I think it's just one of those things that I think you'd always have around. They grow excellently from cuttings. You can just sort of propagate them very simply. I've never actually grown one from seed myself, to be honest. I've always just done cuttings of other plants, and they grow great. So yeah, I would strongly recommend having one of them. Like I said, it's great to be able to grow something that is a good plant and something you can't buy. Next up, we have Rosella. And for people who aren't familiar, that's a form of hibiscus. And the reason that I like Rosella is that it grows quite well in the tropics, and it's a bit unique. Well, not unique, but it's the first one on this list, which is not perennial. I suppose it sort of can act almost semi-perennial, but in terms of there is more of a season to it, I suppose. And like mulberry, it's good in that it is something that you can't really get easily. You can't buy it, essentially. I'm sure you can, but it's not like it's commonly available to get. So yeah, if you're not familiar, it's a hibiscus plant, effectively, and it produces it's like a flowering tree, essentially. And the thing that you actually tend to harvest is either the leaves or the calyx. And you can use these for teas, but also for jams. So mostly you would use the leaves for teas. It also can be used as animal fodder, like a lot of these sort of stuff does, especially if you're having goats. I don't know, it's a bit of a theme here. I keep referencing the goats. Goats love eating leaves. You can actually feed goats quite easily on smaller properties compared to something like a sheep, which needs a lot of grass. If you've got a relatively small property, you can feed your goats a lot just with some basic trees, really, because they just love getting the fodder and the forage rather than the grass. Anyway, I digress. The Rosella. So leaves are good for teas. It sort of has a bit of a slightly sour sort of note. It's quite high in vitamin C. I'm not a real tea person, so the thing that I'm more interested in is the calyx. Now, if you're not familiar with the calyx, effectively it is the sort of outer area before a flower. It's sort of like a bit of a star pattern. So when it is actually on the plant, it looks a little bit like a bell, somewhat similar to a banana flower, actually, the banana flower. And if you leave that, it will open up, and then it will form a flower, and then there'll be the seed pod inside and everything like that. But if you're thinking of something like a tomato, the green sort of base on a tomato, like near where the stem is, there's like those sprouted out sort of star sort of pattern. That is the calyx that forms around a flower. It's the start of the flower, and then that will open up. So what you commonly want to do is you want to harvest the actual calyx before it's opened up, and it will be sort of a ready purple color. It looks sort of kind of alien, to be honest. It looks a little bit like, if you've seen the War of the Worlds, the Tom Cruise movie, the aliens come and they have a plant that they spread, which is like a red sort of color. It always reminds me of that. And what you want to do is you'll harvest that calyx when it's still tightly closed. And then sort of getting into more of the thing I use for it mostly is jam. And it's actually a very easy jam to make. And like I said, the cool thing about it is that it's not commonly available. Like, you can't really go into the supermarket and buy it. It's more like a thing that you would pick up from small markets, particularly in Queensland and something like that, or you maybe see sort of the CWA Fate or something like that. And I think that's always a cool thing when you're able to grow something and produce something that you can't buy. And the reason that it makes such a good jam is its flavor is somewhat tart, and I feel like that is an important part of jams. I mean, obviously, a lot of jams, they tend to want to have something like a lemon juice in there for a bit of tartness to the jam to sort of cut the sheer sweetness. But I actually find it to be a little bit like a tropical form of rhubarb. I do grow rhubarb sometimes, but I find it a bit difficult in my climate. I find it's a bit too hot where I am. But I find that it's basically sort of similar. When you actually eat either a rhubarb or a rosella, it's a little bit tart on its own. But if you have to stew it or cook it and mix it with some sugar, then you're really going to bring out some really nice flavors, and it's sort of like that. For the jam, which I said is the most common thing that I use it for, it's actually very simple. All you need to do is you take all of your calyxes, you harvest them, you wash them. I typically just do this in the sink in the kitchen, and you actually strip off sort of the petal part of the calyx, let's call it. It's like the fleshy sort of part, and you put that in a bit of a pot, or you put it sort of aside, and then you take the green seed pod that was inside the calyx, and you also wash that. If it sometimes you'll find that it started to go a bit black or brown, or sort of a little bit sort of rotten, I suppose. Discard those ones, but take all of the green seed pods that you can. So, like, I might typically harvest, say, 2 liters worth at a time, like an ice cream container or something like that. So you take all the green seed pods from inside and you put them in a saucepan, and you cover them with just enough water so that the water is over the top of the seed pods, just a tiny bit. And then you boil them, not for long, maybe 10 minutes or so, just enough so that you'll notice that they've leached out a lot of color. And even though the seed pods are a bright green, the water will become sort of a rose sort of color. And then what you want to do is you want to fish out the seed pods and sort of just discard them. You can compost them, I give them to my chickens, whatever you want to do. And you've actually done that to get the pectin out of the actual seed pods. And then what you want to do is put the sort of the calyx leaf bits, the petals, whatever you want to call them, you put them into that water, and you want to sort of gently boil it for, I'd say, about 20 minutes. It's going to depend on how big a batch you're doing, but generally about 20 minutes. What you're waiting for is until essentially they break up into a mush. You don't want to see individual calyx parts in there. You want to see a amalgam of semi-fibrous mush. Essentially, it's all sort of one amorphous blob, and then you want to sort of mash that. If you're real keen, you can use something like an immersion blender, but the point is you want to try and get it somewhat smooth. You don't want too many different chunks of different stuff. And then after you have done that, then you'll have whatever quantity you have in your saucepan. Just measure that in a measuring cup. Like, say you've got 3 cups worth of that mush, which is the initial water that you boil with pectin and the calyx parts. Let's say that's 3 cups. You do an equal part sugar that you will then mix, so obviously very high in sugar, and then just back on a gentle simmer, and you just want to sort of stir that round until all the sugar's dissolved, and then you want to let it thicken. I don't know if you've made jam before, but a general sort of thing you can do is you put a plate like a small tea plate or something, in the freezer so that it gets quite cold. And then when you think the jam's getting thick, then you take a teaspoon of the hot jam mixture and you take it and you put it onto the cold plate, and then, being careful not to burn yourself, you either use a finger or something else to essentially slide through the dollop of jam that's on the plate. And if you find that the liquidy jam, once it's sort of been cooled by the plate, if you can make a clean patch between the two, like they don't immediately run back together, that means that the jam is probably thick enough at that point. And then you can just take it out and put it into, sterilized jars or some other sort of container. And that makes an excellent jam. It's great, like on bread and all that sort of stuff that you do, but also, you can use sauces and everything, put it on ice cream. But also, because it's slightly tart and obviously very sweet, it actually really works quite well on fatty meats. What I will tend to do is take, say, half of my Rosella jam and then mix it with a little bit of a mild vinegar and chili. And you get like a slightly tart, slightly sweet, slightly spicy sauce. And on something like duck or something like pork belly, those quite fatty, rich meats, having a hot, tart, sweet sauce is actually very nice. And it's great just for your own use, but also it makes fantastic gifts, or if you're sort of into it, you want to barter or trade or sell or whatever. Again, because it's somewhat difficult to get, then it has a real value. And a lot of people might remember growing up and getting Rosella jam from the CWA stalls or whatever, and they can't get it anymore. So it is really a nice thing to have, and so I always try and grow it. It is seasonal, but I find that it will often self-seed. So I'll have just patches where I will go and wait until the calyxes are going, and then I'll harvest them as frequently as I can, but you never get them all, and they will, produce quite a nice flower. And, again, you can use all that for your teas and everything if you're into that. But then they'll also just drop seeds and they'll self-seed, and you can effectively just have patches keep going and going and going. So I would say for a typical homestead, I reckon maybe 5 to 10 plants is sort of all you need to be able to get your amount of jam that you would sort of use. Obviously more if you want to give it away or anything like that, but just keep a patch and it'll just keep growing and growing and growing. You can feed it to your animals. Yeah, highly recommend. Moving on to a true seasonal crop, and that is the pumpkin. Now, I can't grow these year round, but I am able to get a decent harvest out of them, and they produce a bunch of good results for me. So, pumpkins, I will typically grow them from seed. You can go and get some heirloom varieties, and I've done that from some of the ones that I'll get. Like I like some small dwarf ones sometimes. So for my homestead, we're only the two of us, so we don't have any kids or anything like that. So when we are going to eat pumpkin, we don't necessarily want to have a big, 3, 4, 5 kilo pumpkin, because once we start cutting it up, obviously they don't last as long. So I tend to prefer smaller pumpkins if I can. So I've got some little miniature based pumpkins, but also I'm a big fan of something like a butternut pumpkin, because they're quite reasonably sized and you can grow them, and once you grow them you can just basically keep them in a cool, dry place, and the pumpkin will last for months, without any refrigeration or anything. They store quite well as long as you don't cut them. So I tend to grow my pumpkins the miniature variety anyway. I will grow them in my raised garden beds, but typically something like a Kent pumpkin or a Jarrahdale or a butternut, I tend to grow in what I call my mini paddocks, which are small areas where I grow them just on sprawling in the ground, and I will sort of just have them grow as they are. I tend to just save seed from previous pumpkins that I have grown, or really you can just harvest the seed from ones that you grow from the supermarket, and something not that you grow from the supermarket, that you buy from the supermarket, and I find them to have great results. I really do. I know that there is a whole bunch of reasons why people don't want to do that for biosecurity and stuff like that, but if I'm being honest, I've never had any problems with it, and I find it very easy and successful. So the good thing about pumpkins is they produce a big vine. You can eat the leaves if you're keen. I'm not a big fan. I find them too furry, I suppose. Though, once you start cooking them with some oil and salt and maybe a bit of garlic, then, you can use those as a leafy green. But as I've mentioned before, I've got plenty of leafy greens, so I don't bother. But my animals love them, particularly the goats. They are a big fan of the leaves. The chickens will eat them, but yeah, it's not their favorite. But the goats love them. So I will find that if it's starting to get a bit overgrown, I will harvest the leaves and I'll feed them to the animals, and then I will just leave the pumpkins to keep growing. Depending on if you've got a male or female flower and what your pollination's like, you can also eat the flowers. You can use them in a salad. They're quite pretty. Essentially they're a cucurbit. So you like courgette flowers, like all of that sort of stuff. You can eat the flowers in a salad, but you can also do them tempura and deep fry them if you're really into it. But for the most part, I grow them in a big enough quantity that I just let them sprawl and leave the pumpkins to sort of come back and harvest them. Again, I like the butternut. They're probably my favorite that I would go with, but anything will do well. The pumpkins themselves are also excellent animal food. The thing that I find loves them the most would be pigs. And if you have one that's a little bit sort of rotten or something like that, if you just smash it on the ground, the pigs will just go into it. They love it. Similar to how they like sweet potato. It's that, they're quite high in iron, they're quite high in protein. They're a nice sweet flavor for them. If I'm particularly pigs, if I'm raising them for slaughter, which is basically the only reason you would raise pigs, I find something like feeding them heavily on something sweet potatoes, a pumpkin, or mango, if you can get it, really will increase the quality of the meat. So that's another reason to grow them. Plus, like I said, they store excellently. They're a great sort of calorie crop. You can do a lot with them: roasted, steamed, mashed. They make great soup, and it's just very little effort. So then once I have harvested my pumpkins, I will just open up my millie paddock and let my goats in, and the goats will eat all of the stalk, they'll eat all the vines, they'll do everything, and then they deposit manure for the next time. So yeah, I always like to try and do a run of pumpkins if I can, and then that would typically tend to last me through to the next season if I'm able to store them correctly. Moving on to the passion fruit, which I am a big fan of. These are a perennial vine sort of plant if you haven't grown them before. They are perennial, but they don't tend to live a long time. You're usually sort of stuck to about a 7-year lifespan, it seems, and then they'll just die off for whatever reason. They're not the best when grown from seed. They can take a long time to actually start producing any fruit. It's not the best. It is really better if you buy a grafted tree or vine or whatever you want to call it, and sort of, you'll find that it's going away. It'll be around for a while, and whatever, it'll last for years and years, but then it will eventually die. It is a very seasonal sort of fruit. I mean, in the tropics we do get a longer sort of harvest season, I suppose, but you will notice that it definitely is seasonal. But the good thing about that is that it's one of the easiest things to store. So we all know passion fruit, right? We get it you can get it in cans and you can get it from the supermarket and whatnot, but it's so expensive when you want to try and buy it, and for essentially what is just a flavoring element. So I like to grow my passion fruit. I have a sort of a 4-foot high fence, which in our house yard, I suppose, and we grow it along there. It does form a bit of a dense foliage barrier, which is nice, and like all the things I'm talking about, I can feed that to the goats. I have to be a bit careful because sometimes I will bring the goats into my house yard to clean up the weeds, and they will go for the passion fruit, which isn't great. because then they can rip bits of it off. But it will just sort of spread everywhere and produce the fruit. I like the Panama variety, the deep purple, but there are a lot of common varieties that you could use as well. The thing about harvesting it is you don't actually want to pick the passion fruit from the vine if you can avoid it, because it can be hard to tell exactly when it's ripe. And the better way is just to leave it until it falls on the ground, which is actually the way that they are typically harvested in a commercial sense. They will have the big vines in an espalier sort of setup, and every day they will just go past and find which passion fruit have fallen to the ground and just collect them, which is what I like to do. Typically, when you see them in the shops, they are far more wrinkled than when you'll find them when they are just fallen off the vine. There's not really a good or bad part about that. I find that when they're more wrinkled, it's when they're obviously more dried out, which it seems like the actual inner sort of pulp dries out a little bit as well, which tends to make the overall pulp a little bit sweeter. So you can just sort of wait for that, and it's also a little bit stickier, I suppose. And so you can wait until they dry out a little bit on a bench or something like that. You just got to be careful that you don't leave it too long and they don't rot. But what I like to do is, when it's passion fruit season, I will just once a day, same as how I collect the eggs from my chickens, I will just go over to the plants and look for any passion fruit that I have to collect. And then I will typically put them, I'll put them all into a basket, I'll wash them off, I cut open the passion fruit, I scoop out the pulp with a teaspoon or something similar, I put them into like a measuring jug or something like that, and then what I will do is I use silicon ice cube trays, and I will put the pulp mixture into those silicon ice cube trays and I freeze them. I like to freeze them individually on my upright freezer, and then after, say, a day when they're frozen, I will pop them out and put them into Ziploc bags as ice cube sized pulp from the passion fruit. You've got to be a bit careful when you do this, though, that when you freeze them in the ice cube trays, you want to get them out after about a day or so. If you leave them in the freezer uncovered, effectively the water will start to sort of boil out effectively from your pulp, and you'll end up with more of a sticky top residue on top of the ice cubes, which isn't necessarily a problem. It's just it's a little bit stickier, it's a little bit less clean, all that sort of stuff when you're trying to pop them into your bag, your Ziploc bag, and freeze them. And obviously in the freezer they will last, I don't even know how long, a year. I always tend to use them or so. I feel like a lot of the times when people make statements about how something will last in the freezer, I feel like they undersell it. I think if you store something in correctly in the freezer, it will last way longer than people say. I hear people say 3 months for fish. I've eaten fish that's 2 years old that's in the freezer. As long as it's stored right, it's not like it's going to go off. It's only freezer burn that you're worried about. So just seal it so it's not getting freezer burn. Anyway, the passion fruit will last for a very long time in there. You can then just sort of treat one ice cube tray versus one ice cube block, I suppose, as maybe a one or a half of a passion fruit if you're doing it in certain recipes like that. You can, for making various curds or icings on cakes or something like that. But also, I really like to just use the ice cubes as they are. It's a very nice way to sort of have that tropical sweet flavor in a drink. So let's say I would use a white wine with some ice cubes. I would sub in a couple of ice cubes of passion fruit pulp and maybe an ice cube worth of lime juice or something like that. Adds a really nice flavor to the drink, and you can sort of really get a good couple of uses out of it, as in you can fill up again with the pulp and it still gives flavor. You just have to be a bit careful about taking the pulp in with your drink when you're drinking the wine or whatever. But yeah, it's a very useful plant. It's a high value plant in that if you actually think about how much passion fruit you get from a typical vine every year, versus how much it would cost you, say $2-3 per passion fruit if you were to buy them from the shop. And the fact that you can just freeze the pulp and it's just there at a moment's notice, especially if you just do it in ice cube trays, they really thaw out very quickly. I would always like to have them around. Like I said, they do only last about 7 years, but when it gets to about 5 years, you can grow another plant next to it. They're not very expensive. I always like to just buy them from a plant shop, but if you're real keen, you could start grafting your own, I suppose. I suppose the main problem you got to worry about, for me at least, is cockatoos. The birds seem to love getting the green passion fruits for whatever reason. They never seem to want to wait until they're actually ripe and good. They eat them when they're green. So, you can try to net them, or you can try and sort of have bird scarers, I suppose. But typically, if you've got a couple of vines, and well, for me at least, I just sort of accept it as part of a tax that the birds take some of them. I generally find that I still have plenty left over, so it's one that I like to grow, and I will keep growing for a long time yet. Coming to the last on the list, somewhat of an unusual one given the sort of food crops that we've been talking about before. And I suppose this is a food crop in a way, but it is sunflowers. Now, I really like to grow sunflowers. I grow them seasonally, and I grow them in my mini paddocks that I have down near my goat yards. I like to grow them. I treat them basically as a grain. I'll buy the grain from the feed store, sunflower seeds that you would typically feed to birds or something similar, and I basically just rough up my paddock, the earth, and then I will just broadcast the seeds and sort of try and then rake over the soil again and just let them go as they are. I don't sort of baby them. I don't grow them in sort of seedlings or anything like that, typically, though I will sometimes take the seeds and sprout them. When you sprout them, they will produce a small 2-lift sprout, which you can then harvest and use as a microgreen, and it's actually really nice. It's sort of like a woody flavor with a bit more sort of body than a lot of other microgreens, in that a lot of things like, say, alfalfa or broccoli or something like that, they're sort of like a thin, lighter sort of sprout, versus it's almost like a heavier, like almost like a bean sprout, something like that, when you have the sunflower seeds, but like with a really nice sort of firm nuttiness in the sprout. Actually makes really quite a nice pesto for like a pasta sauce or something like that, or added as like a nice sort of sharp relief through salads. So really like those as well, but that's just a different sort of use for them, for the seeds, I suppose. But for the actual plant as it is, I will sort of throw them just in big sort of areas in my mini paddocks and sort of just let them fend for themselves. And they have a bunch of uses. An underrated use, I suppose, in homesteading is that they look nice, and you can use them as cut flowers, and that's important to some people, like my partner, who enjoys them. They look pretty, right? So they're a nice sort of looking flower that you can just look at, and you can take into your house. But also they attract pollinators, or if you have bees, they feed you bees. And you can use both the flower heads, I suppose, and the seeds, and the actual stalks themselves. So obviously we all know about sunflower seeds, and so I buy them from the feed store because they're good for feeding animals, and most notably chickens. So you can harvest the actual sunflower head, which will have a whole heap of seeds in it. If you're real keen, you can thrash them out and you can save the seeds, but typically I will just cut the flower head off and I throw that in with my chickens. I let them do the work. I embrace the chickenness of the chicken. Why would I do the work if they're going to do it for me and have a good time anyway? So I just will throw it to them. But you could also save the seeds for yourself. I mean, roasted sunflower seeds can be quite nice with some salt. It's not really what I tend to do, but certainly could if I was bothered to do that. But also I have the stalks and the heads. So you can throw the whole thing to something like a pig. It will eat the seeds, it will eat the flower, it will eat the stalks. The goats, they love eating the actual stalks themselves. And you can also end up taking the stalks and dehydrating them and forming like a kind of flour. I did it once as a bit of an experiment. It was fine. I mean, I didn't really see the super value in it, but if you were really into it, you could say mix half of the flour that you get from the stalk, the powdered stalk, mixed with like a typical wheat flour, and you could use it for some of your dishes. More as a thickener than anything else, because it doesn't really have any gluten in it, so you're not going to get any of that protein that you'd get in baking or anything like that. But for thickeners and stews and stuff like that, or flatbreads or something like that, they work out. But yeah, they're easy to grow. Like I said, I just broadcast them out, and I'll sort of have them as a harvestable crop. They're pretty, they attract the bees, they're good feed for the animals, they condition the soil, and they're just a nice thing to have around. So I always try and grow them maybe once a year, depending on when the season's right, as part of my grain. All right, so that's all 10 of what I consider to be my hero plants for the homestead. And these aren't obviously the only plants I grow. I grow a lot of plants all the time, and I'm always trying new things. But those are the 10 that I will always try to grow. Like, I will make sure that I'm doing some form of it at some time, because it's not just they tend to be plants that I can use for a multitude of reasons. They're easy to grow, they're not much effort, they have a high reward. This is why I always try and grow them. I definitely love growing other plants, and I'm sure I'll talk about them in the future. But those are the ones that I try and grow as often as I can because of all their uses and their simple ease of production or unique values. So that's sort of it for this first episode of the Tropical Homesteading Podcast. Thank you for listening. I'll hope to be back shortly with more tropical homesteading products. Thank you very much. Bye.